I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 22nd. There are many different aspects to our mobilization that we're involved in this week. And as you probably all know, anybody that's on this call is probably aware that we're involved in a worldwide deployment that is essentially been, in one sense, upgraded, has been expanded since last Saturday, at a time that we had a forum that in particular was called for the purpose of beginning the discussion of the 10 principles for the creation of a new security and development architecture. These principles were written by Helga Zepp LaRouche, and what we had begun was a process of discussion, but that discussion was in the context of an actual mobilization we were doing, which we referred to as Dona Nobis Pacem, grant us peace. It referred both to a musical canon, probably written in the early 18th century, perhaps 17th century, three-part canon, which we have made the kind of motto, we shall overcome, of the movement to bring about a process of which there is actually a negotiation for peace based on the 10 principles that Helga formulated. And so that's what we're doing, but it's also got another element to it, and that element is very much in evidence from what we saw in the case of the United States last night. And what that element is that clearly it is required that a leadership emerge in the United States that may only be adumbrated by, shadowed by, the institutional structures of the United States. It may have to come directly out of the people of the United States, which is not an unusual circumstance. It's certainly not an unusual circumstance to consider at the time of Christmas. That's exactly, of course, what occurs in the mission of Christmas. That the mission does not come from, the saving of the world does not come from the palaces, and it doesn't come from the empire, and it doesn't come from the military, but it comes from poor people, but who are involved in a divine mission, echoed in a different way by the case of Joan of Arc in the period of 1428-29 in France, a similar circumstance in one sense, in imitation of the mission of Christ. And so that, in one sense, is the cost, if you will, for the American people of discipleship in the image of the religion they purport to profess. That's not a challenge to people. It's just the way it is. In this time of year, this holiday is so disrespected, it's so brutalized, that this mission is virtually never discussed, and consequently its revolutionary implications for people's own sense of identity are unavailable to them. This became very much in evidence in some things that we saw last night in a speech which you can call it that. It's really a large-scale fundraising effort, one of the largest in history, which we can call the Fool on the Hill. The Zelensky speech to Strawberry Fields on the Potomac. Where you have all these people sitting there in this drama, which is completely orchestrated. There was not one element of what you saw last night that was not thoroughly orchestrated, up to and including statements being made by Zelensky completely contradictory to what President Joe Biden himself had expressed in the form of a press conference and in other remarks, saying that, actually an escalation in which we gave equipment that we're not yet giving of a more advanced nature could end up in a war with Russia. And instead, what we had was this lack of talent show in which Zelensky asserted complete lies about what existed on the battlefield of a type and character rarely seen in history. Now, of course, people who may have seen this saw a drama, and they will say, well, I didn't see it that way at all. Well, of course you didn't, because if you are either a devotee of or addict to American entertainment of the past roughly 100 years, particularly the last 60 years, then that's how you would have experienced it. And that was the issue. That was what was done. London is probably more responsible for that appearance than Washington is. Washington may have agreed to it. But when the London Economist featured 3 people from Ukraine, Zelensky and 2 of the military commanders, what they said and what they laid out in the London Economist coverage is that the war is about to be over. And we need basically far, far, far more than you have provided. Now, of course, when the British hear that, they say, we must therefore go to the United States and get what you need. And that's just the way it works. And so you have a sort of a dramatically absurd situation in which the notion of the number of Patriot missiles, for example, that we're sending, having any strategic impact is just just foolish. It can't do that. You can't fight wars with wonder weapons, not real wars. And of course, that's one of the great mistakes made in warfare, particularly by people who believe in this idea of air power and super weapons that supposedly decide everything. One might say that would seem to be contradictory to our emphasis on thermonuclear weapons. But our point about thermonuclear weapons is that the use of the thermonuclear weapons are insane, and that's why they would be used. That is to say, we're not talking about wonder weapons to win war. We're talking about the use of weapons for the purpose of creating a circumstance in which government is done by war. That's what the conception is, the study of war as government. And so you've heard the idea, sometimes said in the old Negro spiritual, I ain't going to study war no more. What that means is that that's the precise idea of the campaign that we are carrying out. This is not a liberal campaign. It's not a campaign that's coming just from the idea war is bad. No, it comes from the fact that the transatlantic financial system is self-doomed. It is trying to propel itself by means of war. This happened 100 years ago in the form of what people call World War II, but was really World War I with a 20-year armistice between 1919 and 1939. It was all one war in which the looting of Europe, the self-cannibalization of Europe, became a worldwide catastrophe and disaster. In this case, the entire transatlantic sector, most emphatically including the United States, is thoroughly bankrupt, physically bankrupt, has been so for the past roughly 2 decades or 2.5 decades, in which it's been declared that the United States is the most advanced economy. It's a new economy. It's a digital economy. It's a cyber economy. It is a dead economy. It is a zombie economy. And the reason that you see the zombification of the population over this country, and you see that despair, and you see all the other things you see, is because of the fact that is the truth. Now, our job here is to walk the United States out of this. And to do that, you can't just do it because you will yourself to do it. There has to be a set of principles, but there also has to be a conception of what the spirit behind these principles is, and having an idea of how current history is only an expression and a footprint of universal history. So one of the things we want to do is to have a discussion that begins tonight, which Gerry Rose will begin, and I think it's going to be a 3-part series, where we're taking up this idea of the 10 principles for a new international security and development architecture. We want everybody reading these, but we don't expect that. It's not a question of it kind of being an academic, sit and read them and we'll give you a test on them. It's not a question of simply getting people to sign a document saying that they agree. That's not the idea at all. There has to be a commitment to nonviolent, direct action that has the impact of preventing the self-destruction of the transatlantic sector. Let me just point out a simple fact, and then we'll move on to Gerry forthwith. The $858 billion official military budget, which does not include what's called the black budget, so the secret arms deals and so on, but just taking what the figure is 10 times the size of the American military budget in 1968-69, at the time that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech Beyond Vietnam and talked about the United States as the greater purveyor of violence in the world today, which pained him greatly to say. He called it his vocation of agony, because he loved the country and he did not wish to bring that that to the country, but he had to because it was his mission as a religious figure. Okay, that budget, $85 billion, is the size of the present Russian projected military budget for 2023. In 1969-68, that budget was sold to the American people on the premise that we got to stop communism, particularly the Soviet Union. Red China was not a big deal because it was too weak. It was supposed to be an underdeveloped country, so forth and so on. Okay, Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet Union is gone. The Great Crusade was won, and our budget is now 10 times the size it was in 1968. Official budget. So when you look at Ukraine, Ukraine had a budget of $48 billion in 2021. We just sent this year to Ukraine $68 billion. So the important thing here is not the money. The important here is the lunacy. The important thing is the insanity. And so what has happened is you have an unprincipled policy being carried out by unprincipled people for an unprincipled purpose. And the issue is who will stand up for principle, who can find principle. So the issue of Christmas and the issue of the season and the issue of trying to create an international mobilization would require that somebody put forward an alternate set of principles and policies for the purpose of resurrecting not only a deliberative process, but the actual freedom that has been lost and has been abdicated in the transatlantic sector. And so that's why we're presenting this. And we begin this discussion tonight with Gerry Rose and the presentation that he's giving. And I just want to make sure I use the title, hold on, which was The Strategic Issue of Sovereignty, How to Stop a Century of War. So, Gerry, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I hearable?
Clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just want to give the context for this three-part series. For those of us who have worked with Lynn and Helga, what she presented was what you would call a singularity. And by the way, I think this bulleted thing is a lot less effective if we just, honestly, I'm going to suggest it, just that speech she gave, which was 17 minutes, is much more nuanced and much more intelligible, actually, because these are not bullet points. These are strategic conceptions. And the precondition, and this is what stunned me about she had been working on a number of initiatives. And, of course, the question of a new strategic architecture. She had been working on that, thinking about that. She had started Operation Ibn Sina, in which the need for a healthcare system. So she was, but then at that discussion that she initiated, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually brought the whole concept that she'd been working on, and it became the strategic development architecture. In other words, it was all implicit in everything she did, but in presenting it in the way she did, to me, was a singularity. Because what does that mean? It means that the conception that's behind it, and she's elaborated this in different places, the conception behind it is a unified whole. And that unified whole which has certain aspects of it, is what Cusa would have called the one that transcends the many. And that the implications of what she said, without the way she presented it, the deeper conception and the way she presented it, the solution concept wasn't clear enough. And what she presented there becomes the basis, the principal basis for the actual solution to the problem facing mankind. And the way, if I've listened to it twice today, and I recommend people listen to it, because what Helga presented was the implications of, one, of course, the oligarchical principle, which is this unipolar world, but that the multipolar world, as it's being presented, would not function. I mean, it's certainly better than the unipolar world, but it wouldn't function. It wouldn't work, not with the concatenation of problems that the human race is facing. It wouldn't work. And they're a fundamental set of principles. And only at that level could you actually solve the problem of the security development architecture. It's one idea, and it was always one idea. And it comes together on the question of the nation state, which is what I'm going to take up tonight, in terms of the discovery, the actual way the nation state, the first nation state, which is Louis XI's France, came into existence. It's a stunning story, but I will tell you one of the obvious conclusions of it, which is something you have been lied to about probably since you went, everyone on this call went to school. They say that the nation states cause war. In fact, it was the foundation of Louis XI's France that ended 120 years of warfare. And what he did in founding France on the principle of the Commonwealth, which we will discuss tonight in some detail. I think there's been yeoman work on this. Stephanie Ezra has done a magnificent article on this, and Irene Baudry did a magnificent article on Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, in which the actual genius of Joan of Arc and Louis XI made a fundamental breakthrough that could not have been even considered under the conditions of warfare, under conditions of the Black Plague, under conditions of pure anarchy, which dominated the French elite, which I will sketch out tonight. And you'll get the real sense of what the first sovereign nation state and the stunning implications of what it actually meant for mankind, which is what Helga references, as you'll see, in this discussion of sovereignty. Because it's not just sovereignty to do your own thing. It's absurd. And okay, so where does the story actually begin? It actually begins with the 1346 invasion of France by Edward III. And in The Distant Mirror by Tuckman, Barbara Tuckman, she develops the breakdown of the institutions that ensued, particularly in France, after the invasion of Edward III. In fact, within a year of his invasion, the Black Plague broke out, not because of his invasion, but it was the Black Plague was the marker for the breakdown of every single institution of society. The church, the inability of the nobility to react to anything real is very reminiscent. The reason she called her book The Distant Mirror, it was very reminiscent of what she perceived in the 1960s and the takeover of all the institutions by a set of ideological axioms that were not at all, the marker was the Vietnam War for her. She also was a devotee of Franklin Roosevelt and actually worked in the military, not as a combat soldier, but she was in the military during World War II. So what does she describe? At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the Edward III, the French nobility on French soil at Crécy, in fact, outnumbered the British forces, the invasion forces, by 4 or 5 to 1. And they were completely destroyed. There was no cohesion in the attack. Each of the nobility, because only the nobility were the cavalry, and they were in these, these armor. And each little, every single cavalry guy had a number of other guys around him, and there was no unified command. So they attacked the English longbow, which was wielded by working class and farmers in England, completely wrecked the French army, completely wrecked it, and they seized Calais. I'm not going to go through a whole story, but they seized Calais in the wake of Crécy. Then, because of the Black Plague, they had to go back. But in 1356, at the famous Battle of Poitiers, again, the French nobility, this time led by the French king, did the same exact thing they did at Crécy. They didn't coordinate their attack. They didn't use any artillery or the equivalent of artillery. And the French king, it was such a slaughter that the French king was captured by the Black Prince. He was the son of Edward III. Was captured and brought back to England and held captive there for massive ransom, which ultimately they defaulted on. and the king went back. In fact, King Jean went back to give himself up after he had been released. So this was stunning defeats, absolutely stunning. So that and then you get to the famous Battle of Agincourt, in which the same exact mistake, in which the French, again, massively outnumbered the British or the English. But because of the longbow, because of the inability to even consider what the battlefield was, it was complete mud at the time, in which they all bogged down. So that by 1415, when the Battle of Agincourt was won, the French had been defeated for close to 100 years in every single battle, exactly the same way, which is which of course is one of the points that Barbara Tuchman makes. So at the Peace of Troy, which was in 1418, France was handed over to Henry V after the Battle of Agincourt. We just handed over to him. And the French queen said that Charles VII, which was the famous Dauphin of Joan of Arc, who was the rightful heir, he was Charles VII, was deposed by his own mother. Not his, yeah, I guess so. It was his mother, Isabeau. Well, maybe it wasn't his mother. I'm not clear now. But Isabeau said that the son, Charles, that later to be Charles VII, was not legitimate. He was not the son of Charles VI. So she was working with the English. Burgundy was working with the English. And they seized France. Now, to show you the complete insanity of the French oligarchy, there was when Charles VI, who was mad, he went in and out of bouts of sanity. When Charles VI was not in his right mind, his queen, who was probably sleeping with the Duke of Orleans, were running, who was his younger brother, were running the country. And I believe they were, I can't remember, I think they were Burgundy, Bourbon. Or maybe they were the other faction, Armagnac. I get it confused. But anyway, what happens? Charles the Fearless of Burgundy, well, obviously then they were Armagnac. Charles of Burgundy, John the Fearless of Burgundy, has, in full public view, has the Duke of Orleans killed, just assassinated, and then the insane King Charles VI said, well, it was a mistake or whatever. He couldn't run anything. Then later, that happened in 1407. In 1418, I believe it's John the Fearless or whatever, the Burgundy guy, is killed while they were negotiating peace, is killed on a bridge by the entourage of Charles VII, who was the rightful king after the Charles VI. But it's 1418, after the murder of I guess it's whatever the Fearless, John the Fearless. After the murder on a bridge by Charles VII, they cut a deal by 1418 with the British to bring them into Paris. And Charles VII, who was the Dauphin, had to flee Paris and hide out. This is the context for what Joan of Arc, this is what she walked into. The French army had been defeated for over 100 years. The French oligarchical army had been defeated for 100 years in almost exactly the same way. Now, what Joan does, and Irene Baudry, really documents this, is she said, well, look, and she said it out loud to everybody, my mission is to make Charles VII the King of France and crown him at Rheims. Because that's where the kings of France are crowned. And in one of the most remarkable epics, stories in human history, she convinces the Dauphin, who's hiding, to give her an army to liberate Orleans that had been surrounded by the British forces. And if Orleans fell, that would be it for Charles VII, the Dauphin. So she rallies, she doesn't listen to Charles, she doesn't listen to any of his generals. She goes to Orleans with a troop, and she personally mobilizes the fight. How she got to the Dauphin is a very interesting story too, but I don't want to go on all night, right? And she personally mobilizes the fight. And she was taking, she absolutely understood that her mission was to save the population of what was later to become France, based upon an absolute certainty this was the truth, that this was necessary, and that the Word of God, as she understood it from the Virgin Mary, as she understood it, would guide her every action so that truth would be triumphant. And after 100 years of defeat, this Maid of Orleans was capable of inspiring the French military and inspiring the people of the town of Orleans in one of the most bloody battles of the 100 Years' War. And there is a wonderful description of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, who was not a great guy, but he was completely inspired by Joan, and wrote the actual. The battle was, what she did. She was wounded the first day. Normally that would be it. She came right back on the battlefield. She led the charge at every turn. She never failed the troops. And in what Irene describes, in an act of genius, she does something completely uncharacteristic. And the last day of the liberation of Orleans, they were hoping that the French would make the same mistake they made for 100 years. They would charge the cavalry, and the English longbows would cut them down. And they took up a defensive position outside Orleans. Joan brought all her troops outside Orleans, and they just stood there. They didn't attack. And the English realized, since they had vastly outnumbered and they had fought for 2 days incredibly brave and successfully, the English deserted Orleans. The first victory of the French. And after that, she made a brilliant campaign of leading these troops and artillery fire. Irene describes it, to crown Charles VII at Reims and establish the kingdom, establish him as the French king. Now, he deserted her, the Dauphin. And I'm not going to go through the whole story. But he deserted her, and she was burned at the stake. In fact, they were so afraid of her, they burned her twice. They burned her ashes. After a totally corrupt church had tried her as a witch. But what occurs is that the church is mobilized in and around the Council of Florence, in which Cusa and Pope Pius and others were actual humanists, and completely exonerated Joan. In the wake of that, and the death of Henry V, the early death of Henry V, the French were able to rally with the image of Joan and take France back and put Charles VII onto the throne in Paris itself. So it was, now the Dauphin was a very ambiguous figure at best. But his son, Louis XI, who defied his father, would not, he just had no respect for his father. And in the work by Stephanie Ezrol, she really details the emergence of Louis XI in the first. He was his father tried to get him out of the realm, so he sent him to a place called Dauphiné, which was his first, as a young man, And let me just read you what he did at Dauphiné. He called all the estates together, the nobles, the clergy, the working class people who had the merchants, and he created a parliament. He abolished all internal warfare in Dauphiné, in the area. He encouraged actual agriculture by erecting tariffs to defend agriculture in the area. And he set up the first postal system in all of Europe. Now, this is only a down payment, because when he finally came to power in 1462, I believe, or 61, whatever, he just to read you, he wrote something to his son called The Rosebush of War, which is, Kathy Naughtley did a translation of this. All of this is if you look it up in Fidelio. But let me read you what his view of the prince was. The prince must provide for the maintenance of the public works and edifices, make improvement and repairs on roads, the bridges, the ports, the walls, the moat, and the other things which the towns and castle are necessary. And then he goes on to say, to consider the duty of kings and princes and their cavaliers, that their estate and vocation is to defend the common good, both ecclesiastic and secular, to uphold justice and peace among their subjects, and to do good. They will have good in both this world and the next. And if they do evil only, affliction will come. It shall come to pass some day that one must leave the world to go and give an account of one's undertakings and receives one's award. To risk their lives for another among all other estates of the world is to be most praised and honored. And because of the common good, which concerns many, which is the common weal of the realm, is more praiseworthy than the particular, which often has frustrated the common good. We have freely put into writing the acts of princes and cavaliers and all the good doctrines which serve their estate. So the idea of the commonwealth, which he identified as in building up cities, such that the farmers would not talk to the beasts and be part of the beasts of the field as serfs, but they would have cities and an idea of commerce, an idea of themselves as part of a human community. Now, these ideas occur in the context, remember, the 1435 Council of Florence had occurred. Earlier, you had a number of what was called the Brethren of the Common Life, which was a teaching order that had people read the actual church doctrine for themselves, translate it, and it was a teaching order for everybody. Mainly, there were a lot of orphans involved in it. So that, on the one hand, there was a context for what he was saying, but that the oligarchical rule that had destroyed France, that had created total anarchy, needed a person of genius and will to implement these precepts. Without that, there would have been no nation possible in France. None. So the first nation state, and I'm going to go through some more details, but the first nation state in history, as you can imagine, was founded by two geniuses. One, Joan of Arc, who was a genius, and Irene goes through it. And Louis XI, who was let me give you some more details because it'll shock you. I was shocked. So he in his 22 years in office, he used his tax policy. He taxed the oligarchy and defended public work, created public works, put tariffs to defend agriculture. And I'll read you. Louis enacted labor laws to protect the rights of foreign workers because he was recruiting foreign workers to come into France for productive purposes. And he set standards of production. He encouraged the immigration of engineers, printers, musicians, miners, farmers, armor manufacturers, artillery specialists, iron foundry workers. The immigrants were supplied with the instruments of labor, land to build a house, and and the qualification that they make the land productive, which was a policy, as we know, of Abraham Lincoln, 40 acres and a mule. Also, he issued in a letter of naturalization, he abolished the right of the state to seize the land, property, or manufactures of foreign-born subjects and allowed them to become free subjects of France, if they so wished. He set up very stringent regulations for dealing with food, the sanitary laws. One of the first acts as king was to establish a regular supply of provisions and housing for the army, because the army, after the Black Death, the armies all over Europe were just seizing things and looting. So he created a national army that was that would only do his bidding, which was critical in defending the nation. He also took a census of all productive land in the nation, that which was not being used properly. He seized and drained swamps, and he made those lands productive. There were a number of other things, but I'm giving you a sense of the kind of reforms which, and the reason I went through what was in France was that you had war after war after war. Little feudal oligarchs causing war with other oligarchs. As I pointed out, this battle over the king Charles VI, in which one faction killed the other faction, and the other faction killed the other faction. And this was the context for the creation of the first nation state, the Commonwealth, the idea of the Commonwealth. And it ended the 100 Years' War. Louis because his invasion from England was always he bought off the English kings. He just bought them. It was York at that time. Now, here's the kicker. Because Joan and the consolidation of Louis, because of what Joan of Arc did, kicking the English out of France, Shakespeare, in his first Henry VI and Richard III, that's his first play, history play, these two together. The first action was Henry V dying, the 9-month-old son, or whatever, is young, Henry VI comes to power. The loss of France sets off the War of the Roses in England, and Shakespeare documents in a brilliant strategic study of oligarchism, and how the bitter hatred dominated society, bitter hatreds of the oligarchy for each other. And what ultimately happens is that Henry VII, who was at the French court at the time, it overlaps with Louis, because Louis dies in 1482-83, actually. It overlaps. But Henry VII, being lived in France, because he had to escape Richard III, takes over England and establishes peace through iron law against York and Lancaster, the two warring factions. He had to, on the one hand, attempt to unite them, but on the other hand, he had to crush them, which he did. Now, he was not Louis XI, but the idea of the Commonwealth and the Italian Renaissance, which came through Northern Europe also as part of the Erasmus of Rotterdam. You had, of course, later Rembrandt. You had a whole flowering, and Stephanie also identifies that Louis XI funded a beautiful music program, the best in Europe at the time. Brought some of the top astronomers there, but this idea that somehow is warring nations, it has never been warring nations. That the nation state, the idea of the sovereign nation state, committed to the Commonwealth, to the idea of a society based upon the bringing out the best of the other, was the, as long as you have that that the nation state, which later became the American nation state, which were founded on these principles of the general welfare. But until then, and that's why I went through the details, until then, as Barbara Tuchman points out, you had the feudalism, which was the destruction, really, of and the degeneration of the Roman Empire. It's what it became, and the idea of the Diocletian laws that created the serfs and slavery. So I think I'll stop there, but I just wanted to identify that the Helga's raising of the nation state, I wanted to give people a sense of what that actually meant and how it was created. So I just wanted to present that tonight.